Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.
Mr. López-Calva, thank you for being with us and taking our questions. Let us start our conversation with the key findings that you have for the Tbilisi air pollution report.
Thank you for the opportunity. I think this is a very important and potentially very impactful analysis that the World Bank team led here in Tbilisi with the support of partners. The report looks at three things. So one is the patterns of pollution in the city, both outdoor and indoor pollution. Then it relates this to the levels of socioeconomic conditions for the households and also for the altitude because it's related to that. Second, it looks at the effects that this has on the households, looking at, for example, health-related impacts, but also on productivity and aspects which are less known, like mental health as well. And finally, it introduces a very concrete intervention to provide different types of information to the households and see how they react. And by measuring that impact, we actually see that people change their behavior, particularly when they get information about the effect of pollution on their in different dimensions, but also when they get information about the level of pollution in a specific days, and then they change their behavior to adapt.
So what do you see as the main impact of the study, of the report?
Well, the first point, and it's a very important general finding, is that even though the government has been very active in introducing policy responses, and that has helped to reduce the level of pollution, it's still at close to 3 times the level that is recommended by the World Health Organization. So there's still a lot of room to improve, so it's a quite high level. So that's very important finding. The second is that this affects disproportionately households that are lower income and less well educated. And the third finding, which is for us the reason to be optimistic, is how the provision of information actually changes the way people behave and can help them be more protected against the impact of both outdoor and indoor pollution.
So what are some of the policy actions that could be taken to mitigate these impacts?
In general, when we look at climate-related or environmentally related issues, we look at 3 types of actions. So it has to do with regulations and laws, has to do with policies, particularly market incentives through prices, and third, it has to do with behavioral changes. More concretely, in the specific case of this study, there are aspects related to monitoring and management of monitoring systems. There was an important law passed in 2020. The idea is that law creates a space for this more active monitoring. We believe that more can be done. But I think it's very important to monitor and provide information on that and use that for policy. Second, it relates to transport and traffic. Traffic in general is a very important source of pollution, outdoor pollution mainly, but also how we can invest in different types of public transportation, and particularly transportation that is cleaner in terms of the impact on pollution. And finally, very important, related to exposure to industrial emissions. So there are issues related first also to regulations, adoption of certain standards. There is also an important law that was presented to Parliament in 2023 on industrial emissions. But also the idea that industry should be also given incentives to invest in new technologies that are less polluting. In general, the idea when we talk about market incentives is really about making it more costly to consume or produce in ways that produce more pollution, and making it easier or cheaper to transition to technologies that are cleaner.
Do you think Georgia is ready for this transition process? Because Georgia is still a developing country. It's not that rich to provide all these incentives. So what type of prioritization is needed in terms of policy actions, in terms of financing, and who should be the driving force of this transition?
One important aspect of this report that was presented today is that it looks at how poorer households are more exposed, for example, to indoor pollution than outdoor, even though, of course, outdoor pollution eventually also has implications for indoor pollution, but I think related, for example, to smoking or the type of cooking. Mm-hmm. So I mentioned this because when we talk about these type of changes, sometimes it's actually relatively low-cost interventions, sometimes just related to information, as I said, and as the report presents, but also changes in the way, practices about cooking, the issue of smoking, or keeping windows closed during certain times in which pollution outside is higher, or very relatively low-cost action. So those are definitely something we should understand and pursue more proactively. The other type of transition, I would say that is very feasible for Georgia in general and Tbilisi in particular, because some of them have actually been adopted and has to do with regulations and the enforcement of these regulations, and maybe translate those regulations, for example, about monitoring and management of pollution and traffic and transport, more also to local plans. So really localized and having very specific responses at the local level in terms of how to react to those. But the other has to do, as I said, with industry, and that is the one that may require, when we talk about large investments in either transport or industry transition to cleaner technologies, those are the ones that would require more financing. We believe that the incentives provided by the EU and some of the programs that the EU very proactively is willing to fund and accompany the process of also regulatory change is an opportunity. And the international community can be part of this process. But also I think what the report shows is that local actors can play a very important role. It's not only about international community, EU incentives, and so on. Of course, government responses that have been quite proactive, but also civil society, also academics, and many local actors that can be part of amplifying the messages, creating awareness, and supporting this effort to disseminate information and trigger potential responses.
Are there any correlations with, for example, rural and urban places, and how that works? Because when you said higher educated, more well-off people are mainly in urban areas, and you see poorer people distributed mainly in regions. So are there any specific correlations, and should these policies be targeted towards urban and rural places?
This is an excellent question. There are two levels of this. One is certainly the urban versus rural, conceptually. And then is, for example, we were discussing this morning during the presentation about the fact that certain types of heating that in other countries are more based on less clean energies. In the case of Tbilisi, heating is mainly through gas. So I would say that this report focuses more on Tbilisi per se, but within the area of study, there are important variations. So for example, the idea that contrary to what the team expected, relatively wealthier areas are also exposed to more outdoor pollution. However, within those areas, those that they can afford move into places that are less exposed. And this is related, for example, to houses, the pricing of houses. So there is a correlation, for example, very clear between the pricing of housing and how this leads to certain type of sorting. So people that can afford to move into those relatively less exposed areas do so. So yes, that's why the markets also matter, and how you introduce incentives through prices is an important area. But you mentioned the idea of targeting policies, and I think this is very important because you can think of populations that are more vulnerable, as we said, maybe people who are less able to absorb the information, or people who are more exposed to indoor pollution or in poorer areas, for example. So the idea is that policies should be also directed specifically to those more vulnerable populations that are either more exposed or less able to cope or to respond. So if we have more targeted policies, we can be more effective. So it's not only about general policies, it's also about very concrete and targeted interventions that can be really effective.
I like this idea of linking air pollution not only to, for example, health, which is obvious, but also to the general economic framework, how economy responds to this pollution. Thank you for that. You mentioned that the focus was on Tbilisi, but do you think that these approaches might be replicated, might be scaled up? Could Tbilisi become some kind of a role model with this report for the rest?
As you mentioned at the beginning, I'm actually I play a global role in my position in the bank, and one of the reasons why I'm here is because of the relevance that this particular issue has in many places globally. So I would say that, of course, within Georgia, this could be not only replicated but more effectively used to lead to better monitoring, to better interventions, and so on. But I think I definitely see this as a study that can be replicated and used in other places, in other regions, in other parts of the world, because it's very important. One message that is very important to give, and this report helps us with that, is that we tend to think of environmental issues and poverty reduction always as two things that we have to choose between them, right? It's like a trade-off. And this report shows that actually, if you are very effective in reducing pollution, you are also being more effective in having pro-poor policies, which means the impact of that effort to reduce pollution is going to have particularly a positive effect on the poor. So the fact that these two objectives go together is a message that is very powerful, and I think it's something that we want to bring to other places as well.
So if we look at on the global scale first, where is the world poverty-wise? Because the pandemic, now this war, these events are kind of amplifying this poverty, right?
Correct. Actually, if you take the extreme poverty line that we use globally, which is $215 per person per day, corrected by purchasing power. And if you look at the effect of the COVID pandemic, actually it was the largest increase in poverty globally since World War II. So this is it was a huge effect. Now we have recovered, and we are at the global level. We are more or less at slightly higher than we were pre-pandemic. So there has been a recovery, but most of the recovery has been in upper middle income and lower middle income countries, but not in low income countries. So at this moment, globally, the extreme poverty is mainly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. That really contain the largest share of extreme poor population. But if we take a higher standard, which we also use globally, which is $6.85 per person per day, which is the poverty line for upper middle income countries, which is, by the way, not a very high standard in terms of income. 47% of the population are under that line. And then East Asia Pacific also starts to play a role. So yes, so I would say that extreme poverty is very much regionally concentrated, but as you take higher standards, it becomes more a middle income problem. So in that sense, we want to send also the message that when we talk about poverty, it's not only about Africa, it's not only about South Asia, it's also about middle income countries that are struggling to generate more inclusive growth.
Where do you see Georgia more specifically in that big picture?
Georgia, if you take the extreme poverty line, actually Georgia basically has eliminated because it's lower than 3% for that extreme poverty line. However, if you take the 3.65, which is the intermediate poverty line, which is for lower middle income countries, Georgia would be around 12% of the population. And if you take the higher that I mentioned before, Georgia will be about 47%, between 45-47%. But if you take the national poverty line, or for any line that you take, Georgia has done extremely well in the last decade. Actually, if you take the national number, poverty has been halved between 2010 and today. So it's at the level of 15% of the population. So that is a very successful story. The question is perhaps 2 points. One is how to accelerate so that group of the population that is still poor can be lifted out. But the other question is that many people are above the poverty line, but still vulnerable to fall back into poverty. And that's about 2/3 of the population. So to answer your question, yes, I think poverty, in terms of poverty reduction, Georgia is a success story. But I think there are still important challenges in terms of giving people enough economic security so they don't fall back into the condition of poverty.
And lastly, to summarize our conversation, what would be, you mentioned some of the main key messages that you want to deliver through this report. What are these main key messages? What should we concentrate on?
So I would say that in terms of this specific report, the main messages is one, pollution is almost 3 times the standard that WHO suggests for as acceptable. So in that sense, pollution is very high in Tbilisi. Also important to say that it has gone down because of government action, but there is a long way to go still. Second, to say that this particularly affects or disproportionately affects poor households, particularly indoor pollution. But third is that with very specific types of information provision and relatively low-cost interventions, you can trigger a behavioral change that can be help them be more protected, but also that you have more general policies like regulatory changes, industry emissions, traffic and transport that can help reduce this effect on the population in general and particularly on the poor.
What is World Bank's recommendation in this regard? Which way should be prioritized? Where should the government start or take off?
The first thing is that it cannot be done sequentially. I think everything has to be done at the same time in terms of insisting on or emphasizing or deepening regulatory changes. Second, trying to come up with policies that look at issues related to traffic, to public transportation, to cleaner ways of transportation. Third, trying to induce these behavioral changes in the population, but also with this idea of targeting those interventions. I think the idea that the monitoring systems have improved is something that is to be praised and something that has to be emphasized. But I think it is important to make the point that policies that reduce pollution levels, first, are pro-poor, but second, also have an economic impact, positive economic impact, because of the negative effect of pollution on productivity in general.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
The Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.